afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the Vrakas Blum Computer Consulting monthly webinar series this month featuring year-end, everybody's favorite, right? My name is Kelly Bergman, and I'd like to quickly address just a few housekeeping items before I hand the floor over to our presenters. All the attendees are in listen-only mode. As we go along, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat or a Q&A section. Go ahead, enter whichever one you like. We'll address them all at the end. This is being recorded and will be posted on our website within the next week or so. Now, with that done, it is my pleasure to introduce Kristen Baumgartner, Sales and Consulting Specialist. Wow, it must be a Friday. And Justin Teague, Consultant for Vrakas Blum Computer Consulting. I could go on and on about how great these two are, but I'm pretty sure you've all seen them in the past, and that's not why you're here. So I'll bow out now and let them take the stage.
All right, thank you so much, Kelly. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get launched into our presentation today, and we are going to be focusing on year-end processing. We're going to shut our cameras off just for now so that you can actually focus on our presentation. When we go through this, I definitely want to address a couple agenda points so you kind of know what you're in for the next hour. We're going to talk about why year-end matters. We're going to talk about why this is an important time of the year. We're going to talk about our order of closing, our Sage module review, and our special considerations. So we really want to make sure that you understand within each module, what are things that we're going to see that are common across all of them, and what's something that might be a little bit more peculiar to these specific modules. Justin's going to take it over. He's going to handle our Sage payroll conversations along with W-2 and 1099 and ACA reporting. And we are going to have, like Kelly mentioned, a Q&A at the end of our session. Please use those options, whichever you prefer, whether it's chat or Q&A. We can queue those questions up and we will definitely address them at the end. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, our very first question is, when we're talking about year end, what happens? And Justin, I totally know the answer to this one. Should old acquaintance be forgot and never? Is that right? Is that what we're doing today?
Not exactly. No, I mean, that does happen, but that's not what we're talking about today.
I'm much better on the partying side than the accounting side, but that's all right. We'll actually get to the meat and potatoes of our presentation.
So, yeah, we're going to talk about a little bit about, it looks like we skipped a slide here, but yeah, we're going to talk about what basically happens when you perform year end, as it is different than performing period end, and what you should do to prepare for year end, and how you can sort of make sure that, oh, we got a hand raised. Yes. We got a hand raised by Christine. Oh, audio's cutting in and out, she says. 1 second.
Okay, I can hear you just fine, Justin.
Okay.
I would say if anyone else is having audio issues, please let us know. Put that in the chat so we're aware of it. But internally right now, it sounds like we're coming across fine.
Yeah, I did get a little bit of clipping earlier, but it sounds okay right now.
But if that definitely becomes an issue, let us know.
Yeah. Okay, so so we're talking about what happens when we perform year end. So there's a lot of housekeeping that Sage performs when you perform period end, and that happens also during year end processing, and there's some additional things that happen during year end processing. So the period to date balances are cleared and obviously moved to the next period. Year-to-date balances accumulated in the master files are cleared out and updated. Your year-end dollar amounts are recorded and then carried over into your beginning balance for your general ledger. History retention settings, and Kristen will talk about this a bit more during her segments about managing your setup options and module options. Any history settings you have, like how long you're going to retain your history, records older than that span of time will be purged during period end and during year end processing. and it is important to note that unlike period end processing, once you do close a year, you can't post to that close year again without reopening it. So it's good to make sure that you've completed everything that you have to in the current year, and that you're ready to proceed forward. And I'll talk also a little bit about steps you can take in a second here to make sure that if you do need to access data from that previous year for purposes, particularly for year-end reporting purposes, that you still have access to it. So let me jump to next slide. So year-end is a great time to review a lot of the settings in your system. Also, it's good as you approach year-end to consider some other things, and these aren't necessarily directly related to the year-end process, but as you move into a new year, it's good to take a second to assess your environment and things like, what is your disaster recovery plan? So if your servers go down, do you have robust backups? Do you have a recovery plan in place for with your IT provider or your network administrator in case something happens to your hardware or to your software? Do you have enough space on your server going forward? Is space becoming an issue? Do you need to consider cleanup on your server? Do you have excess files or old backups that you can remove? Are you compliant and up to date? And we'll talk about this quite a bit. It's important for the purpose of 1099, W-2 reporting, year-end reporting. If you're going to perform those operations through Sage, it's really important that you make sure that you're on a supported version, that you've run updates ahead of time to make sure all that's up to date. And there's a window for doing that, and we'll provide those dates too. But currently the 1099 forms for 2021 haven't actually been pushed out yet, but that should be happening very soon. So that's an important thing to consider as you move into that year-end process. We'll talk about reviewing history retention, reviewing your users and your security roles. Are there users that need to be locked out because they're no longer in use, or employees who are no longer in your organization? Are your history retention settings correct for your reporting needs? And then aside from that, making sure that your key employees who are going to be performing these year-end processes know what they're going to have to do, have their questions answered. And certainly we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions now as we can, but if they have them going forward, you should always feel free to reach out to us. And then of course, how can your ERP help improve processes next year? As you go into a new year, it can be good to think, what are our pain points? What are inefficiencies we have in our system, and can we in the coming year address them? There's a lot of other things, things like paperless office, we're using those, VI imports to save data entry time, so on and so forth. These are just a few examples of the sorts of things that you might consider as additional functions that your system can perform. Sage certainly is capable of doing a lot of things, and it's good to keep in mind. I will kick it over to you now, Kristen.
All right. So we're going to start talking about the module options review. And as we've mentioned, it is an important time when you're talking about the year end to assess how are things going to look in your future years as well. It's like most people are writing New Year's resolutions towards the end of the year. We need to have our Sage resolutions up. And one of the first steps that we like to point out is always looking at your setup and your review of your individual module options. And what's really important here is how we're retaining our data in history. So in the example that we have up, we've got accounts receivable. Each of your Sage modules will have their setup options, and usually you're going to have that history tab. When you look at your history tab, you are going to have areas where you can say, how much data am I retaining? So in this example, again, for AR, we have actually two settings available. One is for the cash receipts history and the other is for sales history. We're going to see pretty common that most customers are going to float around that 7-year mark. It is possible to house less data, but we really want to point out, if you have defaulted settings or if your settings for any module is set at 2 years, what this really means to your Sage system is that you're only going to be retaining your current year and then 1 year prior. So if you're at 2 years, we're definitely going to push to you to say, you know what, you're probably going to want to expand that. But in reality, again, for most reporting, we're going to see most customers sitting around that 7-year mark. Now, one other thing to point out here is it's not just in your history settings tabs for your modules that we can see some of this information. One of the great examples is in, again, accounts receivable. On the additional tab, we also have some areas where we can tell the system how much months to retain. One thing I want to point out here is specifically in AR. Once we hit Sage version 2020 and up, this is actually changed. It's now calling out months to retain your paid invoices, where previously it was days. So make sure that we're really reading the details so that you're setting this correctly. So you're entering in either 90 days for your 3 months, or again, in your upper versions, really showing that 3-month period. Because we're also giving our New Year's resolutions to our Sage system, just like most of us will go through a pretty thorough house cleaning or after the holidays, we want to make sure that your data is pretty clean too. One of the ways that you can do this is removing old purchase orders and sales orders from your system. Now, I actually stole this screenshot from a colleague of mine, Dana Halpin. I did not have a system with this many records in it. I don't know how she found this one, but this has 17,000, almost 17,000 records in an order number list. This is an insane amount of data to have open at this period of time, and especially because you're seeing the dates on some of these. It's a good time. Look at your purchase orders and your sales orders. If you have things that are legacy open, this is a time when you would want to start removing those out. It's just a nice little housekeeping tip to keep your data segments and the amount of data you're housing really clean. It also helps these lists load a lot faster. You also can look at your batches that are created if you're doing batch tracking within your Sage environment. Many of us who work on batches will see older ones open, especially if you are looking at 0 entries in these batches. Typically, this indicates that they are not viable anymore. These are great examples as well that you can clean up this data so that when we launch and we need to review our batches, we're looking at something that's a lot more current than having to scroll through and look through older time periods as well, especially if there's nothing in them that we can actually review. We will see a lot of the time, we're also going to recommend clearing audit reports for customers, vendors, or inventory. If you are retaining audits, not everyone does. Again, year-end's a great time to purge this audit file. This file can get extremely large. And when we're doing Sage upgrades, a lot of the time we recommend reviewing this and purging a lot of this data as well. At year-end, again, great housekeeping tip just to be able to keep your data sizes and your data files under control. So we're not keeping a bunch of extraneous information that we may not necessarily need to really get at. Any of us that are using paperless Office, this is also a great time to remove your old Office forms. So when you launch the viewer, sometimes you will get a message saying that not all your documents can load. And that's really because there's so many records that the system is asking your permission to add all of them and to actually review all of them. You can go through, if you're using paperless Office, and remove these PDFs, and you can reprint them from your history if needed. It's not like they're completely gone, but again, it's just more data that's kind of gumming up the works. And having a nice clean data scrub is always a great key to keeping ERPs running smooth as possible. We're going to transition into the order of closing. Now, for any of us that have gone through a period end close, this is our Bible. This is what we really want to focus on. Now, the order of close is important for many reasons. Number one, if you want to have a clean roll up, all of these modules will talk to each other. Before we touch anything though, I'm going to reinforce, and you're probably going to hear me say it a bunch of times, back up your data. One thing you have to realize with Sage 100 is that you can only reverse a closing by restoring from a data backup. There is no one-click easy option to say, you know what, just undo everything I just closed out. There's no way to do that. If you do not have a data backup, there is no way that we can assist, or you can even do on your own, that kind of reversing feeling if there is a major mistake made. So again, before we do anything, always take a snapshot of that data just to make sure that we've got a point to go back to should we need it. Before any closings, again, this is usually something we have to time with our colleagues. Users need to be out of Sage. We don't want some of the things in process. We don't want any tasks being completed. We don't want anything open. We want to make sure everything's closed down so we can actually roll these. And we do need to coordinate that time with our colleagues. In this order list, if you have a module that is not activated, if let's say you're not using bill of materials or you don't use MRP, these are things that you can just skip in this order that we go through. But there really is a Sage logic here. This order is laid out because each of these individual modules rolls to the next one down the list. What that actually means is, like, if you were, again, example of sales order, you can see that that's pretty early on the list. When you actually do a period end and a year-end close for sales order, that information will then post up to inventory management. It will also post up to things like AR and eventually up to our final, which is GL. If we do these out of order, we're basically not giving the system the full data pieces that it needs. We don't give it everything. And now we've got open transactions that have to be reconciled in a different way. You'll also notice there are a couple of these on this list that don't actually have a period end function, but we do recommend this is the order that you go through them so that you can review those settings, make sure everything is set the way that you need it going into your following year, make sure all your transactions are posted. So definitely pay attention to some of these guys, like your bill of materials work order. We've got our manufacturing, which is operations management, or job ops, as some of us might know it. And you'll also notice bank rec doesn't have a true period end function, but these are all things we want to make sure are clean and good before we go to a full actual year-end close. Now, Sage is very helpful. They try and give us closing checklists. They want to make sure that we're all educated to know what we need to do. And each Sage module is going to have its own closing checklist. And those can always be found in the Sage help files. We're going to talk about that in just one second. But there are some common pieces within those closing checklists. This is, again, across all modules. We're going to make sure that all transactions are entered and updated for each module. Okay, we don't want anything open hanging in there. And a lot of the time you're going to get messages that say you can't continue because you have transactions that are not yet posted. We want to make sure that GL, daily transaction register, is updated. We're going to print and save any reports that we need before closing. We're going to make sure everything gets reconciled to the GL, and then we can perform our period end processing. Now, always, again, you're going to hear me say it, pack up that data before we start this. When we start going through this process, we all like to kind of knock out our year-end closing pretty succinctly. Again, we do have to coordinate with our colleagues to be out of the system. But before we start anything, back up that data. Make sure we've got a good, healthy database to go back to should anything need to be restored. Now, those closing checklists I just talked about. In Sage, when you go to your Helps tab, there's actually a Help Topics. This will launch your web browser, and what you're going to search on is a period end checklist. And then you're basically going to get a list that is for every single module that you could conceivably want to close within Sage. Well, I'm not a big fan of screenshots, so we're actually going to do this. In my Sage environment, I have my ribbon collapsed, so I'm going to hit my Help Topics, or my Help button, and here's my Help Topics. When I launch that, here comes my web browser. And again, what we're going to look for is our period end checklist. When we run this search, and it will take a second, one of the nice things about Sage is they have moved all their help files online. It makes it a lot easier for them to update them. But when we do this search, you can see in our coding where it says subsystems, here's purchase order, here's sales order, here's GL, here's AP. This is really where you can go through and look at all of your individual closing checklists. When you're going through these, again, you can hyperlink right out to them. It gives you a nice tight snapshot of what you need to do. And I also want to point out, if you have questions in this process, Sage does this really well. For more information, see this. If you're interested, print this. Here's your aged invoice report and a link to it. This makes it very easy to jump around within that Sage knowledge base and get to the information that you're looking for as well, even if this might be your first year-end go around. All right, let's get back into our slide deck. We've talked about, again, being able to clean up your data, what our order of closing is, what our closing checklists look like. And I mentioned there's commonalities between modules, but there's also special things that we have to consider for each module. So in accounts receivable, we want to make sure to review the repetitive invoicing end dates, make sure that those are going to match for what we're going into for our next year. We're going to print our sales tax report as needed. We're going to review finance charges, statements, and commissions. And again, this is pretty common for anyone dealing in AR, but it's just something we want to make sure that we're addressing. AP runs the same kind of feel, that we're going to review those repetitive invoicing ending dates. We're going to make sure our AP to AR clearing is completed and our 1099s. And Justin's going to go through that in just a little bit here. We also are going to see in purchase order, we want to make sure we reconcile the purchases clearing report. In simplest terminology, this is what is the report that's going to compare our quantity that was ordered against the quantity we actually received, and ultimately that quantity invoiced. So if you are not doing receipt of goods transactions where you're actually doing your receipt of goods and your invoicing at the same time, we do have 3 separate buckets that we're looking at. We really want to make sure that this is reconciled before we go forward with the purchase order module. In sales order, again, reviewing your tax rates, reconciling customer deposits that might still be outstanding. Inventory, which any of you who know me, this is close and near and dear to my heart, is we want to make sure a physical count, if your organization runs a physical, we complete that physical count before we actually go through our year-end close. Again, getting that scrub of data, that best and most accurate data for our close. Our physical count processes really help us do that for our inventory quantities. We can choose either the valuation report or valuation report by period. We want to make sure that we're reviewing that information. And we're going to adjust any negative tier items. And you can do this using the stock status report. Again, nice clean data for inventory going into this close as well. Now, while we're talking about tiers, we do want to address a couple things here. For your costing tiers, if you're currently using a LIFO, FIFO, or lot serial valuation, you want to make sure you're looking at removing the 0 quantity costing tiers. And this is really part of your physical inventory process. Removing this tier, just to emphasize, does not remove your history. It's removing the record from your cost table. Okay, so please don't think that just by removing this information, you lose all of your history on the item. You don't. It's just cleaning up your costs within your actual inventory module. And again, this only applies if we are in that LIFO, FIFO, or lot serial kind of valuation. Doing these steps, it does make your inventory counts a lot shorter, which when we're talking about physical counts, I think shorter, more accurate, more efficient. Those are things that we like to hear when we talk about physical counts, because it usually puts a knot in our stomach at that time of the year. This is something, again, that makes your life easier to make sure before we launch into a physical count, you really, again, have cleaned as much data as you can before we even launch into that process. And we do want to see that physical count ideally completed before the full year-end close. We also want to point out some ideas with negative tier as well. The first thing you need to do to clean up negative tier is to run that negative tier report, and you're going to review the LIFO, FIFO, again, lot serial valuations that have your negative costing tiers. The majority of the time, the reason this happens is because they were over distributed. We had to get that particular item out the door to our customer, but we shipped it and we didn't really make a record of the recording. We didn't make a record in there. We've got a serial number that's gone negative, those kind of fields. This is where we're really focused on cleaning that information up. When you run the negative tier adjustment report, this will automatically adjust the negative items. The other option is to actually make the changes manually using transaction entry. And this is really, these 2 options are based on your organization and what your comfort level is. Again, if we're dealing with massive amounts of information, we always want to review it, but it is nice to have Sage be able to automatically adjust those for us. But if we want to, again, keep a little bit more control and make sure we're really going everything one by one, we can use that. We can make those changes manually in transaction entry. Once we have those tiers cleared up, again, we're talking about our physical count processes. And I apologize if it gives anybody anxiety. I've talked to a lot of customers through the years where this is not a fun time of year. A couple things to remember about your physical count. It is ideal to freeze your inventory to print your worksheets. That freeze is a snapshot of your quantity on hand, okay? And that happens at the time of the freeze. So in all reality, it's just making sure that anything that, things can keep moving in the background, but that Sage is recognizing when we're making any adjustments or corrections to those inventory levels, we're doing it at that snapshot. We don't necessarily want to have more stock moving around that Sage is not, Sage is always aware of it, but that we have in our counts at that time. I also like to point out there are 2 fields on our physical count worksheet that we actually recommend you do not check. The first one is print quantity on hand, and the second one is our default quantity counted to quantity on hand. This one in particular, I always like to tell customers about. I've worked with personally with a lot of clients that have gone through physical count processes, whether cycle counts or year end. Printing the quantity on hand, it does open you up to a particular situation where, and I'm not saying anything bad about anybody, but if we put a number on that and we print what our quantity on hand should be, we do run the risk of somebody taking a look at it and going, yeah, that's about right, instead of actually counting our items. If we omit this information in those physical count worksheets that we give to employees, they're forced to count. They're forced to record the quantity for us. Instead of giving them that heads up and saying, yeah, that looks like about 300, you'll actually get more accurate counts. Defaulting the quantity counted to quantity on hand. Again, this is something that can open us up where we're not really reviewing anything. And this gives us a nicer, tighter audit if we are seeing items that come back with our 0 counts as quantities. One new feature also want to point out, because again, some of us are still on 2019, but once we hit Sage 2020 and up, we do also have the option to include all of our lot and serial tiers for this worksheet as well. So that's a nice option to have if you're in those upper versions. Another special consideration we want to point out is if for any of us that are using the fixed assets, there is now a posting book checkboxes, and they've been replaced by the traditional grid. And you do have your book name and your close book. These checkboxes, you can select the books that you want to process for period end. So again, it's a little bit of a different look to it, but now you have a little bit more control for anyone using fixed assets. And this was, again, this change happened to support Sage Fixed Assets when we get to version 2021. Finally, our big dog in the mix, our GL. When we are doing our year-end processing for GL, these are kind of some simple things to point out, but you guys should really know about them. We want to make sure that we process all year-end allocations before we close. That's something that we can see, again, sometimes it gets a little looked over. We want to make sure that that's really done in our process. We review our ending reoccurring journal entries, again, before we close that GL. And this is something else that we've seen through the years. You might want to consider holding off on your year-end GL processing and keep that open until all year-end entries are posted from your auditor. This really does help you, again, keep everything in that closed year very tight. Depending on when your auditor gets those to you, sometimes this is possible, sometimes it's not. But it's nice to, again, plan that with your auditor to make sure that we do keep GL open if it's possible. Just like before, we're going to make sure that we are reviewing your date settings for your company code. We want to make sure, again, dates are very important to our Sage system. And when we also get into our upper versions, and again, this started actually in 2019 product update 2, you can actually choose in your company maintenance a document warning. This is enabling this checkbox, which will open these 2 lower panels. This is actually a really great way as a reminder when we get close to that year end that we want to make sure that things aren't falling too far out of our normal close time frame. So we can actually set, and you get to control, if we get error messages going out to our users that actually says, hey, you know what, you're trying to post something outside of a current period, and we can dictate what that period time frame looks like. So again, just a really nice, great little tool Sage offers. So we just make sure nothing gets posted outside of the realms that it really should be. All right, so you've heard my spiel. We're talking about all of our pre-work, making sure we're backing up, making sure that we've got our battle plan in place for that year-end close. We're going to transfer it over to Justin here. He's going to go in a little bit more on our Sage payroll system.
Okay, so let's talk. At first, I want to talk a little bit about things you want to make sure are done on your system before you actually start. Before you're actually into year end, and so you want to make sure that your system is up to date, that you're on the most current version, or at least that you are at the level you need to be on on a supported version with your payroll and also your system in general. And with Sage in general, that is the current version, and then through currently 2019, Sage 100 2019, and payroll has its, as of the new payroll has its own version. The most current version of which out right now is 2.21. And notably, you no longer need to download tax updates manually in the new payroll when you are performing payroll updates. It will, if there is a tax update when you're in payroll processing, it will ask you if you want to proceed to download and install it. And if you're unsure about whether or not you are up to date, you can actually run from the utilities menu in payroll the payroll tax update, which will then go out to the system and check. We have some dates down here for upcoming releases for payroll. The tax update should be pushed out on 12/14 or thereabouts. Payroll 2.22 is coming out in December as well. And then, of course, these are the most current versions of Sage 100 for the accounts payable 1099s, although we don't expect this year for those to change, unlike in the last calendar year, where there were some pretty significant changes to those. And I'll talk about those a bit later in the presentation. So if I go here, so what happens if you're not on a supported Sage payroll version? So it's important to note that if you're not on a version supported by Sage, then you're probably not going to be able to use the built-in Atrix for electronic processing. Now, that doesn't mean that your data isn't being tracked and that you can't still use it to perform outside processing, but you have to remember that if you're not up to date, then you're not going to be able to use the e-filing client for filing your W-2s, your 1099s, 1095s, 941s, a bunch of other ancillary forms if you need them. All of that provided through the electronic filing program that's built into Sage. And really, I'll talk about it as, throughout this presentation, but it takes a lot of guesswork and a lot of additional stress out of a process that can already be kind of stressful because of the frequently changing and complex rules around things like, what you need for your 1099s, what kind of forms, etc. So something to keep in mind ahead of time. If you're not on a supported version and you're looking for help either to get on a supported version or for best practice suggestions to find a workaround for this year, if maybe it's too close and you don't think you'll have time to update, definitely reach out to us, and we can work out an individual client plan to help you to get through year end without having the ability to process these forms within Sage. So notably, now this hasn't changed since last year, but it was a significant enough change that I wanted to mention it still in this presentation. Starting with the 2020 calendar year, the 1099 miscellaneous form was changed. Previously, box 7 was on the 1099 miscellaneous form was reserved for non-employee compensation, which is, I find with our clients, the most common type of 1099 they have to issue. That is now broken out onto its own form, the 1099 NEC. So non-employee compensation is now box 1 on that 1099 NEC form. So if you pay out non-employee compensation, you want to make sure that you're on a supported version of Sage specifically, because only those versions have this updated form, the 1099 NEC option. And there's also, if you're not on that product update, or if you need to move over to it, there's a utility that we can also run that'll move those totals over for you. But it's just something to keep in mind, that form has, that was always the miscellaneous form. You now need this 1099 NEC form. That's also important for making sure you understand the layout of the new form. There's a different actual physical paper form that you need to purchase if you're planning to print out the 1099s yourself. And I'll offer up some alternate suggestions for that. You may not actually need to print them out yourself. So what's required? So if we're going to be filing 1099s through Sage at all, so that includes if you're planning to physically print them yourself, you have to make sure that this Atrix e-filing and reporting client is installed on the workstation where you're going to be performing the 1099 processing. So you can have this installed in multiple locations if you have more than one person who sometimes does this, but whoever's going to be doing this has to have it installed. And once you do try and launch this task, and I'll actually show you this towards the end of the presentation, but once you launch it, it is going to ask you if you want to update the forms, which you do need to do before you actually process. Virtually all the time, you're going to choose this automatic update option, which will just download all the forms, literally all of the forms, and then update them onto the client. I got a little bit too excited there. So the 1099 setups, these are turned on in AP Options 1099 tracking, and that's also where the 1099 calendar year is stored. It's important to note that the 1099 calendar year is separate from your current fiscal year period in AP and any of your other modules. So it is kept in its own box. So you want to make sure that that is right before you begin processing. And AP period end processing, again, is performed independently from 1099 printing. Frequently, what people will do is take a full backup of their live company so that they can perform period end and then print their 1099s later from the archive copy of the company as they're doing year end. And I certainly recommend taking an archive of your company data before you perform year-end processing. As we said, it's good in case something goes wrong, and it's also just good for being able to process these forms after the fact, not have to do them right on the fly as you're trying to do period end. Each individual vendor has their 1099 information stored in vendor maintenance and accounts payable. As you can see from the screenshot, we have the 1099 form boxes is on the second tab in vendor maintenance. It tells us what's the vendor type, what's their default form. In this case, it used to be miscellaneous. This is a picture of the legacy form. Now it will be changed to non-employee compensation. You can also, and I'll address this a bit towards the end as well, this 1099 history button that you see here allows you to view all the totals in all of the boxes and will allow you to review to make sure those totals look right before you even begin processing. And you can actually manually correct them also if they need to be corrected. A nice thing to note in 2020 and 2021, AP invoice data entry now actually pulls that 1099 default information from the vendor record, and you can actually see it right on the invoices. And if you do need to change it for an individual invoice, you can do so, which is pretty handy. So the 1099 data tracking. So it is based on the check date for the vendor payments, not on the invoice date. So we are tracking, the system is tracking when you actually are paying the vendors. So consider that for what is going to fall into the actual calendar year in terms of payments. Again, I talked about this before. As you can see, fiscal period on these options is its own section, and then 1099 reporting and calendar year are independent from that setting. The 1099 form is going to use the vendor's address on the address tab. It's not going to use any of the subsidiary remit to addresses, so keep that in mind when you are doing the filing. If you want to verify all of your 1099 payments for vendors, you can actually run a vendor listing with balances or a payment history report, and there's a checkbox that allows you to verify the amounts. Or like I said before, you can verify them individually in 1099 history and vendor maintenance, if you don't have any or that many, or if you are concerned about a particular vendor. 1099s are run in current versions through the accounts payable reports menu under 1099 tax reporting, and you can run it multiple times as needed. It is worth noting also that you do still, if you are printing the forms yourself, you still need the red form 1099 and the 1096. All right, so let's talk about e-filing and reporting. So if you are printing, e-filing,
Justin,
what costs? Yes.
Sorry, somebody did have a question. How long is version 2019 going to be supported?
So yes, so that's a good question. So the way it works, they support the current version and then the last two versions until the next version is released. So 2019 is supported until they release 2022. Usually we see those releases. I don't know that we actually have a hard date yet for when 2022 is being released, but I would expect that not to happen before probably the summer around there. So
yeah, I haven't seen a hard date for release either, but yeah, like Justin's mentioning, it's usually kind of at the end of Q1, beginning of Q2 that we'll see Sage actually push that release.
Rumors March or April. So
yeah, so probably around like you said, the middle of Q2. So after the end of this, certainly after the end of this filing period. And even if you were on the cusp of that period, you'll still, like, if you're on 2019 now, you're going to have what you need to do year-end processing for this year. If that is, sort of the question. Okay, sorry about that. Didn't mean to barrel right through it. I'll try to keep a closer eye on those. So e-filing and reporting, you're going to have a bunch of different options open to you here. They're pretty granular, and I did take a screenshot actually so that we can see these, and that's a little bit further down the line, but you can print them on your own through the system for free. Of course, there are associated costs there, and I'll talk about this as well, that you're going to have to purchase the forms, and then you're going to have to mail them yourself. E-filing has a fee associated with it, and it is worth noting too, this probably doesn't apply to most folks filing 1099s, but if you ever have to file more than 250 of a particular form, the IRS does now require that you electronically file them. So it's something good to keep in mind. And the same with the idea of outsourcing has a fee associated with it, but Atrix prints and mails the 1099s for you, which I think is pretty well worth the expense. Sorry, I'll learn how to use PowerPoint someday. So Form 1099 tax reporting. So once you're past the update process, you're into the actual filing wizard. It's going to, based on the minimum payment amount that you selected when you launch the task, it's going to load up all your vendors with their associated information into this this grid. And you're going to be able to click through, as you can see this little green arrow, you're going to be able to click through all of the boxes, and the wizard will actually check for errors on any of your recipient data and then highlight them in red for you to correct. So it's not really going to leave any room for any mistakes once you get to the point of filing. You know, assuming you have the right forms, it's going to check over all your data for you before you even get to the point of printing them. It is also worth noting, the federal 1099 copy A and the 1096 forms have to be on the pre-printed red ink forms. So just keep that in mind. Similarly, this, you know, I have these two together because they, while they deal with different sections of your, you know, your year-end and different forms, the process is very similar in Sage. You're using the same type of e-filing client. So for payroll year-end, payroll users should want to update to whatever the most recent payroll is. And there's, you generally speaking, always want to be on the most recent version. Currently, 2.21.2 is the most current. 0.3 and then 2.22 are both coming out fairly soon. So you know, keep an eye out for that. Probably both, I believe both of those will be released in December, as it said earlier in the presentation, unless something happens. So you'll want to update. And again, you don't actually need to install any tax table updates. That's all processed within Sage internally once you have payroll installed. It is good before you do period end, check the unemployment tax rate in company tax group setup and make sure that that is up to date with whatever information you have for your state or your municipality. If there is additional tax, there is, sometimes there is, depending on where you are. Year-end resets, similar to what we were talking about earlier with other modules. The current quarter set and payroll options will roll over to the next quarter, and the fiscal year will also iterate. Time off accrual values are updated based on the settings in the payroll options in quarter end. Well, if you're processing quarter end. Employee year-to-date direct deposits cleared out. Employees marked as terminated or removed if they have no history left retained on them when you do year-end. Pension plan deductions reset if reset at year-end is checked in payroll options. And you see that here in the screenshots. If an employee has no history for a deduction code, that deduction code is removed from the employee's record. If a calendar year is selected to reset time off based on in payroll options, then the employee's unused time is carried over the next year. That's if calendar year is selected for reset the time off. History records, including time track entry history records, are purged if they're older than the number of years for which payroll history is retained. And that's, again, all in these options tabs. And then the current processing year is advanced. Period end checklist. So all of these reports that you need to file, and some of these are, I've highlighted these in yellow. They, a few of these have been deprecated in more recent versions, but I included them if you are still in 2017, 2018. So you want to make sure before you do anything that your payroll module date is the current year ending date. And then in the payroll reports, you're going to want to run the quarterly tax report, check history report, your recap, your deduction report. You can set these up in period end report settings, but also they're all accessible in the payroll reports tab. The quarterly government report is not on the, does not exist as a menu item on the current version of Sage, or the verification report is also not actually there anymore. But then most importantly, you know, for your filing, the federal e-filing and reporting, which is under period end, you're going to be printing, you know, W-2 forms, 941 forms, and any other applicable payroll forms. You're going to want to reconcile your quarterly 941 to the W-3 if you need to. And again, before you do any processing for period end, take a backup of your whole company so that you have it on, on hand if you need to review the year-end data before you did period end, or if you need to reprint any of these reports. And again, period end processing under period end is where you actually perform that year-end processing and iterate the period. I showed this before, same as with the 1099 filing. The payroll federal e-filing is going to ask you to automatically update. It'll update any forms, that are relevant. It actually updates all of them regardless. And once you update that, then you'll be able to proceed to processing. Otherwise, you'll have a message telling you that your forms are out of date. This W-2 setup wizard, very much like the 1099 wizard, will review and look for data, and this is what it looks like if you have missing data for your employees rather. So it'll ask you to fix those. Notably, on both of these grids, you can remove rows if a vendor or an employee doesn't actually need a W-2 printed. You can also add them if for some reason they were not selected or not in your system, and you just need to add them on the fly. So that's something good to keep in mind. But it is important to note that that data will not be written back into Sage 100. So I talked about the filing options before. This window comes up when you get to the step after you get past the previous step and you validated all the data. It'll ask you how you want to file. You can choose to go to other options. You can print your W-2s, but e-file the federal ones and the state ones, or you can manually print them yourself if you want. Or barring any of those, you can go for the complete e-filing service. I think that it's worth the cost, especially when you consider not having to purchase forms, not having to mail things out, not having to worry about having the right forms. It's a really excellent way to streamline the process. And I think that generally speaking, it's a positive experience and sort of takes a lot of the guesswork out of this. Once you select that, and I'm going to show you this in just a second, the window will pop up with your W-2 information. It'll allow you to go through the different copies of the W-2s, print them physically as you need to. It'll ask you to load the paper. It goes through step by step until you've printed all the forms out, and then it'll ask you if you want to update the calendar year. So just as a quick recap, if you are planning to print them out, the employee W-2 has to be printed on blank 4-part perforated paper with the notice on the back. The federal W-2 is to plain paper, the W-3 plain paper, and the state copy is blank 4-part perforated. The employee W-2 copy D, 4 to a sheet, to plain or blank 4-part perforated, and you can order these through Sage actually if you need to. And generally speaking, this step is pretty hand-holding and pretty step-by-step. The system walks you through all of it. If you're looking to email the W-2s through Sage, you're going to want to make sure that in payroll, under employee maintenance, on the taxes tab, there is a W-2 consent, 1095 consent checkbox to be able to electronic deliver these. These boxes have to be checked for the employees. And it will also select the electronic only electronic W-2 field in the 1099 prepare window when you're processing the W-2s. So just keep that in mind. If you have to report for ACA requirements, I have this grid here. They're just so quick. If you have fewer than 50 full-time employees, you don't have to report if you're not you're not self-insured. 50 plus, you have to file a 1095C, 1094C. You have to file those forms. Self-insured have to file a 1095B, 94B, and then also if you have 50 plus, no matter what, you have to file the C forms. Unlike in 2020, there are no extensions for filing in 2021. So that means the deadline for providing individuals forms, the 1095B and C, is the 31st of January. The 94B and 95B forms have to be filed, or the C forms have to be filed by February 28th for paper filings and March 31st for electronic filers. And just like with the 1099s and the W-2s, if you're submitting more than 250, they have to be submitted electronically. So keep that in mind. If you have additional questions about any of these things and need to really drill down, the Sage City support section has a whole year-end section with a lot of FAQs, checklists, updates, etc. This is a screenshot of that page, and that URL is the current URL that can kind of walk you through and review in more depth any of these subjects. And of course, also, if you have questions about them that you feel you can't address yourself, feel free to reach out to us and we can help you with that. So before we go to questions, I did want to kind of walk through what that 1099 or what the W-2 filing looked like. If we have a moment to do that, I'm gonna, yeah, so if we go here, this is my demo company. So in payroll, we're gonna go to period end and then federal and state tax reporting. And you're going to see here we can choose what kind of reports we need to file. In this case, I'm going to choose federal, and I'm going to go to the W-2, W-3 forms for year 2021. My quarter is not set up, but that's fine. And we are going to choose just this guy because I have them set up. I'm going to hit proceed here. And as you can see, it's going to go to federal and state tax reporting. This should not pop up looking for an update because that's fine. I just updated these forms. And so I'm just going to test drive it. It checks for your FEIN, which will hopefully not just be 1 through 9 in order. It'll be a real one. It'll ask you if you have multiple payroll data files. We do not. This is for one company. I discovered that all 5s for zip code is an actual place in Minnesota. So that's fun. You're filing for your company employer. You're not a third party. If you have any tax accounts for individual municipalities and you have to fix them, it's going to let you do that here. As you can see, there's a couple here that are messed up. It asks, to check them. If you have employees who are exempt from any part of Medicare, you have to indicate that here. Members of the clergy, control numbers and W-2s, all those questions. What is your control number box, kind of payer, etc. It asks you, all these questions that are on the forms. You answer before you even get to the point of printing. And we're not going to truncate. And now it's going to generate that grid that I showed you before. Only this one's going to have just one person because I just selected this one guy. And as you can see, if I don't, if I'm missing information, line 1, city, address is blank, state's blank, zip code's blank. So in this case, I'm going to just do 123 Street in town in Minnesota. And it actually validates this field. You can't make up a state. And it's 555, Young America, Minnesota. Go through here. We're not missing any more information. It's going to check all the boxes. It looks for the box information. We're good to go. I hit next. It's looking for all employees are supposed to receive electronic only. I'm going to continue without correcting just because I don't actually care about that here. I'm going to select to print just so that I can show you that. Let's pretend I'm going to e-file these. It still walks through them. I don't want a PDF archive. And then want to go through, and you can reprint these if you have to by going back into the same instance. So don't stress out too much if you do print them and feel, and they print wrong and you have to reprint them. So you can see now I have my recipient's information all in this form, and I can print a copy, but if I click here, it's going to ask me if I'd like to print them, and then it's going to go through to the next form, which we don't actually have to look at anymore. So I'm just going to click out of this. And now it's gonna, I believe, no, I didn't finish it. So I was only in test drive, so it's not asking me to iterate. Yeah, so that's what that looks like. So let's go back to our slide. Do we have any questions? I think we have a little bit of time for questions. We're running a little bit over. A lot of payroll information there.
We have just a few questions, guys. We don't currently freeze inventory for our annual physical count. Does that cause issues?
Justin, I can handle that one. That is definitely a great question. If you don't currently use a freeze for your physical count processes, one thing I will say is it kind of depends on the timing. Truly, a freeze is not required by Sage, but I will say if you can get it done really quickly, if you're doing a count for a small amount of items, it may not be required. But if you have to coordinate a lot with several different employees, you're closing down for the weekend, anything like that, just to get a count done, the freeze file is definitely the recommended way to go. But we can also help you walk through that process should you have any questions as well.
All right, what do I do if my 1099 totals are wrong for some vendors?
Yes, so that's actually a really good question. Kristen, can you bring up that Sage window again? Because I'd like to show people that. So if we go back over to goodbye payroll to company, we're going to go to ABC, the simplest company. We're going to go into vendor maintenance. And as I sort of mentioned here in vendor maintenance, if we go to the additional tab, here's our Anders Auto Repair business non-employee compensation. Got their ID number, default box number. And so if I need to make changes to any of the year-to-date 1099 reporting, say I discovered, oh, I paid them something, but I didn't actually record it in Sage, so the total's not going to be right. You can change that total right in here. So, and you can change the totals for any of the boxes as you need to. You can change them while you're actually processing the 1099s in that grid as well. But if you want to make sure the data is right for history purposes going forward, you can change it right here.
All right, you mentioned to review your AP repetitive invoice ending dates. Can you clarify just a little more?
Okay, I think that was in my section. If you run repetitive invoicing dates in AP, and Justin, I'm going to ask for your help a little bit on this one too. That's something that you want to make sure that your dates are accurate, that they're falling into the right periods. Justin, have you ever had a customer run into that particular kind of issue before where their dates are not correct? Where would we look at that?
So you just, basically if you're in repetitive invoice entry, like these invoices have a start billing and you just want to, and a date last billed, you just want to make sure that your cycle is falling into like neatly into the billing period that you expect it to. So, if your cycle is once a month or whatever, but you're starting in the middle of the month, you just want to make sure that you don't have payments that are landing in a different calendar year than you, or fiscal year than you expected them to. That's the main thing to take away there.
Okay, next question. Do we need to make fiscal year adjusting journal entries before performing the rest of year close? If so, we cannot perform year close until April.
So if you need to make adjusting journal entries, like it depends on how you're reconciling your general ledger. If you're trying to have your general ledger completely reconciled when you do period close, yes. But if those adjusting journal entries are those making adjustments to payments or to expenses that you experience in that calendar year, it's all, because it's also worth noting that even though it's not an easy thing to do, if you need to go back to post adjusting journal entries to a close year, you can actually do that. You can, it's kind of a process, and generally speaking, you don't want to, you know, do it a lot, but okay, they come from a third-party fiscal audit. So, so are they like trying to reconcile to the actual periods from that closed year, or would you just reconcile your general ledger accounts as of whenever you receive those adjusting entries? Because for in one scenario, like if you're just keeping a run, you know, a kind of running adjustment, then you could, they're entered as of December 31st. Yeah, so you could go into general ledger when you receive those, and you could temporarily reopen your year by going back to whatever that fiscal period was that, you know, you set it to 12/20/21 or whatever, and then post those entries, and then set the fiscal period back to the current fiscal period. You just want to make sure, if you're going, like when you're doing that, the most important thing to make sure is that you don't have other users who are also trying to process general ledger transactions. Like I strongly recommend having no one else in the system really making any postings while you do that, but you certainly can. You can set the period back, make your adjusting entries, and then set it back to the current period. You just have to do that through general ledger options. Okay, great.
All right, one last question. Can Vrakas Blum do this for me?
We in fact cannot, for a wide variety of reasons. Some of them federal. If you know, as you saw, like if someone is a preparer, you know, processing your 1099s or W-2s, that has to be declared right on the form. We can advise you, we can walk you through the process. We could literally sit in the background and watch as you click through every window, but we can't click that button for you. We can only operate in an advisory capacity, and that is the letter of the law. But we will do everything we legally can to help you through the year-end process.
So moral of the story is we don't like prison.
Yeah, exactly. As I want to help everyone, but not enough to go to jail.
All right, looks like that wraps up the questions. So if you do have other questions, you always know where to reach us, as always. And I'd like to quickly thank Kristen and Justin for taking the time out of their busy schedules to put this show on for you guys today. What a great way to spend an hour and 8 minutes. Again, to all the attendees, thank you for taking the time to join us as well for our monthly webinar series. This happens to be the last one of the year. We give you a break in December. Go enjoy the holidays with your family and friends. And in closing, contact us if you have any other questions, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all for coming.